Welcome to all our listeners. Ubuntunomics is a weekly roundup and discussion of the most important economic and political developments from Africa. Hosted by myself, Sia from PESA. PESA is a political economy think tank that promotes regional integration in SADC and provides research on the political economy of development in Africa. With me is my co-host, Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Isakombe Assets provides individuals with renewable energy assets in order to develop communities. Hello, Sbu. How are you doing today?
All right. Well, Sia, I'm fine on my side. How are things?
Very well, thank you. I can't complain. So let's get started with the stories for this week. I'll start off with the SA update this week. And our first story for the SA update is COVID-19 TERS applications reopen. Workers affected by the COVID-19 lockdown regulations since March 2021 will once again be able to claim for their COVID-19 Temporary Employee Relief Scheme, TERS. Minister of Employment and Labour, Mr. Thulas Nxesi, signed the directive allowing the Unemployment Insurance Fund, UIF, to implement the third extension of the TERS benefit until 25 July 2021. The UIF opened the system for applications since Monday, the 19th of July, and will commence payments on the 26th of July 2021. This third phase will provide relief for workers who have not been able to work from 16th March 2021 due to level 1, 2, and 3 restrictions, and those who were and are still impacted by the level 4 restrictions and have not been able to work those who have not been able to work due to being over age of 60 or having comorbidities, as well as those who have had to isolate or go into quarantine. However, payments will be made directly to bank accounts of workers and not, as has been before, through their employers, even though employers will still be expected to claim on behalf of workers. This follows findings that certain employers did not advance previous funds to their employees.
I think the part about those who have not been able to work due to the fact that they are over 60 or of comorbidities, as well as those who have had to isolate themselves or put themselves into quarantine. I think that part is good, and I also think it has been well thought out, so that no worker gets left behind. They really applied their minds this time around and tried to better the system. There's this other part where you say payments will be made directly to the bank accounts of workers. That's another good intervention, because many employers crooked the system last time. According to TERS, to the UIF, they briefed, I think some time ago, they briefed the Standing Committee on Finance, Economic Opportunities and Tourism, the Western Cape branch. They said in the Western Cape, 3,800,000 in the Western Cape alone was swindled basically by employers. And again, in last year, the Minister of Labour, Thulas Nxesi, also mentioned the fact that 700,000 beneficiaries had not been paid by employers, even though these employers submitted claims on behalf of workers, they had not passed the money on to the workers. So I wonder what's happening with that. Have you heard anything about criminal prosecutions or anything like that, Sia?
No. So I do remember some of these reports you're mentioning, and this is also partly what we discussed in the story last week when the president had made the announcement that they are reopening the TERS benefits, that they need to find a way to resolve this issue. And it's almost as if government or some officials are listening to our podcast, which is very positive. But one thing I've seen thus far in terms of criminal prosecutions has been one story of a chartered accountant arrested for fraudulent 884,000 rand in TERS payments. So an East London-based chartered accountant has been released on 10,000 rand bail after he was arrested for allegedly swindling the UIF for 800,000 in COVID TERS payments. But beyond that, I haven't heard any other story in terms of the prosecution of the over 700,000 employee benefits who were not transferred to the employees. But I do agree with you. I think this is a positive development in the way in which government is implementing the policy. And we'll have to see, obviously, what challenges they face now, because not all workers or employees are banked in the country. But I think this is definitely a step in the right direction in terms of dealing with that misappropriation of funds by some employers. All right, moving on to our next story, which is Carbon Offset Regulation Amendments Gazetted. National Treasury has published the Gazetted amendments to the carbon offset regulations of the Carbon Tax Act. The regulations set out the eligibility criteria for carbon offset projects, a procedure for taxpayers claiming the carbon offset allowance, and administration of the carbon offset system. The carbon offset regulations were developed jointly by the National Treasury, the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, and the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. The carbon offset component of the carbon tax is intended to enable industry to invest in mitigating projects at a lower cost, thereby lowering their tax liability, and to incentivize mitigation in sectors or activities that are not directly covered by the tax, and those who are not benefiting from other government incentives such as transport, agriculture, forestry and land use, as well as waste. Taxpayers and stakeholders were given until 30 April 2021 to submit written comments to National Treasury before the amendments were effected. And from this, 12 written submissions were received from companies, industry associations, international and national carbon marketing consultants, project developers, as well as carbon market traders. The main comments and changes made to the regulations are as a result of received comments, which include proposals to include new definition of national registries, the Vera registry, and certificate of voluntary cancellation.
The incentives, the carbon offset, that carbon offset price was said to be very low last time. They compared it to international standards when they introduced the carbon tax. So companies were saying this is very low, and so there was most people thought companies would not play along. So companies like the biggest polluters, Eskom and Sasol, simply sat back and they were not perturbed, really. Now, the new Minister of Environment, the Forest and Fisheries, Barbara Creecy, is no pushover, and her department has played a critical role in objecting and taking to court. There's this emergency power project since Eskom has not been able to produce as much power as we need. There was a bid by the Car Power Ships, a Turkish company called Car Power Ships, that they the ministry approached the courts and that contract will not go ahead. It's a 20-year contract, 200 billion rands worth of in value. So, and again in May this year, there was a case in the Pretoria High Court by a groundwork and a Vukani environmental justice movement in action. The respondents in that case are the President Cyril Ramaphosa and Minister Casey and provincial officials, of course. Now, in Mpumalanga, in the province of Mpumalanga, there is an area called High Priority Area. It includes much of Mpumalanga and part of Gauteng. It is a site for 12 coal-fired power plants, Eskom power plants, and an oil refinery, a Sasol oil refinery, and a coal to fuels plant. So a Greenpeace study in 2018 showed that Mpumalanga had the most nitrogen dioxide emissions from power plants of any area in the entire world. So in her
Wow.
in those court papers, Minister Barbara Creecy said that she is taking action to curb pollution from Sasol and Eskom. There are still, however, environmental concerns that need to be balanced with the country's developmental needs, she said. So, these big plants, they produce things, they emit things like mercury and sulfur dioxide, which cause a lot of illnesses in the area. There's lots of people who die from lung cancer, asthma, and there's also things like birth defects that take place. So this lawsuit that I'm talking about now is because the lawsuit I'm talking about is because many people from the Emalahleni, the town that has most coal mining in Mpumalanga, those people have put in affidavits saying that they are experiencing respiratory problems, and there's about 650 deaths in the region in 2016 alone. So together, Eskom and Sasol emit over half of South Africa's greenhouse gases. So and South Africa is the 12th biggest source of climate warning emissions in the entire world. So this minister Barbara Creecy has, sometimes when you have a new face, a new political head, it moves almost an entire department. It changes the working culture within an entire department, because I think if she was there, this is just my hunch, that if she had been there, there would not have been mining. If you remember, there was this mining scandal in the Tolobweni Sands out in the Wild Coast.
Yeah.
I think if she was around back then, there wouldn't have been none of this. She has.
The civil society organizations have tried to fight that, and I think fortunately they've been able to step in and help the process through the courts. But obviously, Minister of Minerals and Energy was definitely trying to push along on that to Gwede Mantashe.
Exactly.
So your point is that she's really had an impact after taking over the department.
My point is she has had a major impact.
So what was your initial point on the carbon offset? Were you saying that the offset amounts were too low and that companies were complaining, or were you saying that our carbon tax rate is too low to have an impact on emitters? I'm not sure I understood you correctly there.
Yeah, but what I was saying is that initially, when the carbon tax was announced, I think our price is something like 360 rands per ton, which is very little compared to international standards. So most companies, most people, most environmentalists basically were saying, no, these companies won't take this up. They won't come up with carbon offset projects.
Sure. Look, I do think that. So you're saying that the amount we were taxing them was negligible, and that it didn't incentivize them actually implementing projects that they could offset against that cost.
Precisely, and the fact that now these what do they call them? These environmental justice movements, they've had to take the government to court to force their hand to say, wake up, do something specifically about ESCOM and SASOL. Because these are SASOL used to be a state-owned company, so there's still that pride. ESCOM is a state-owned company, so the government itself was
taking a leniency against this company.
Exactly.
Sure. Just a correction there. The actual current emission rates were increased to 102, from 120 to 127 rand per tons of CO2 emissions as of the 1st of January 2020. But I guess really what the offsets are aiming to do is to encourage private sector players or emitters to invest in renewable, or to reduce their emissions, and obviously then claim against that. But it'll be interesting to see, because we're currently obviously in the first phase of this, as to whether or not this does have an impact in reducing our emissions as a country. And I guess that will be the litmus test as to whether the rates are high enough to actually encourage companies to take action.
I was saying 360, and you corrected me to say it's about 127. I mean, that's just too little. I mean, even for a layman, a layman can tell 127 rands per ton. It's, yeah, anyway.
Right. So moving on to our next story, the inquiry recommends elections postponement. Justice Moseneke's inquiry on free and fair local government elections during COVID, the inquiry, released its final report to the Independent Electoral Commission, the IEC, on Tuesday, 20th July. The IEC appointed Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke to lead an inquiry into, make findings and report on, and make recommendations concerning the likelihood of the IEC being able to ensure that the 2021 local government elections are free and fair in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and government regulations aiming at curbing the spread. From the beginning of June 2021, the inquiry began receiving numerous emails from the public on whether the elections would proceed or not, and the inquiry received approximately 3,000 submissions from the public by email and WhatsApp text messages and voice notes. In addition, the inquiry received submissions from the IEC, ministers, the government departments, medical experts, electoral monitoring bodies, political parties, civil society organizations, and independent entities. The report concluded that it's not reasonably possible or likely that elections will be held in a free and fair manner, and that elections are likely to be free and fair if they were to be held not later than the end of February 2022. The IEC has committed to study the report before making a final announcement on the way forward within the next few days. After the IEC voter registration weekend on 31 July and the 1st of August, the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, is expected to proclaim the elections, which will trigger an 86-day election timetable.
Will there be a parliamentary process to approve the postponement? Something which might include amending the constitution, or maybe a proclamation by the Minister of Cooperative Governance, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma.
Sure. I think the process will be there, but it's supposed to preempt Minister Dlamini-Zuma's proclamation, because once they've recommended, and I guess we'll have to go for a cabinet or parliamentary approval. It would be a parliamentary, not a cabinet approval, and then it'll then be a proclamation made by Minister Dlamini-Zuma as to the way forward. But I'm not certain as to whether the IEC as itself, by the regulation, has the power without the parliamentary process. But I think, as far as I can tell, the process is via parliamentary approval and then the announcement. But we'll have to actually check on that as to what exactly would be the process. But definitely the idea is that between now and when Minister Dlamini-Zuma is expected to proclaim on the elections, the IEC will make its decision regarding the way forward on elections. And from there, it will then be announced by Minister Dlamini-Zuma in her proclamation as to whether we are postponing or going ahead. But I think at this point, it's more likely that the elections will be postponed.
Yes, yeah. It makes sense. It makes sense.
Yeah. Moving on to our next story from the SA Update this week. Plans to rebuild the SA economy. Government and business leaders from industries affected by the recent destruction of property and violence in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng have committed to work together to rebuild the South African economy. According to Acting Minister in the Presidency, Ms. Khumbudzo Ntshavheni, an estimated 150,000 jobs are at risk in the aftermath of the unrest, which affected over 50,000 informal traders and 40,000 businesses. The estimated impact of the KZN on the KZN economy is 20 billion rand. Representatives, including 90 business leaders from sectors such as retail, agriculture, automotives, telecommunication, banking, and transport, had a virtual meeting with the President, ministers, and premiers of Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal on Tuesday. His Excellency President Cyril Ramaphosa outlined government's priorities, including restoring and maintaining stability with the increased deployment of security personnel, securing essential supplies by opening critical supply routes, providing relief such as immediate food relief to households and support for rebuilding, finding alternative retail sites and rehabilitating shopping centers and malls, and accelerating inclusive economic recovery. At the meeting, the importance of focusing on rural and township economies and increased investment in infrastructure development was emphasized. The meeting also discussed steps to assist companies, particularly small businesses, to claim insurance and access their support measures.
The ruling party and government have been talking about infrastructure development for the past 12 years, and many major South African companies, construction companies, have folded due to a severely depressed market. Now, is this going to go ahead? I mean, you will remember back in 2018 that the government had a 400 billion rand infrastructure fund. The president announced that they will set up this 400 billion rand infrastructure fund, which was supposed to be used as an investment driver rather than expenditure. it was said that the country needed to use infrastructure projects to generate revenue. Government was said that they will take this 400 rands from the fiscus, and this will be spread over the medium term in 3 years, over the medium term framework, and that they were going to do it. The president had just been inaugurated. He had just been. It was his first year, let me say, and this was supposed to be his signature project. I mean, will government do something? Because I can understand that on this one side that the private sector will have to fix their businesses. They've said that they won't even wait for payouts from their insurers. So what they'll do is they'll start doing the work and claim later. That's the business side, that's the private sector. But will government step in for once? What do you think? Well, what are your thoughts?
You mean with regards to the focus on rural and township economies, or you mean with regards to infrastructure?
I mean, with regards to their part.
Well, the government is playing a big part now in terms of the security, right? Which I think is the first step towards restabilizing. But obviously, the problem is much deeper than just the looting, which I guess is one thing, and the destruction of property, which is the one impact that affects business the most. But that, I think, is the first and I guess most crucial step that government is playing in the rebuilding.
Yeah, and okay, I get that part, and we are agreed. Then the next part is focusing on rural and township economies. What will they do?
That's the more difficult part, and it's precisely what I was trying to get you to focus on in terms of what you mean by government response. I think that's just the regular politicking. Look, I don't see that government has a significant... I mean, we're in crisis mode and have been for, I would say, the last 3 to 5 years. Yes, some people would say even much prior to that, if you look at other scandals such as the state capture saga, etc. But what I'm referring to is in terms of the most severe crisis I think is happening over the last 3 to 5 years. That is largely due to employment on a broad basis breaching 50%, meaning we've already got more than half of the labor force which is unemployed. And I would say about 10-15% of that is already discouraged and not looking for any work further. Then we also saw, the rioting and the xenophobic attacks, which were also peaking in the period post-2017. And things, I think, so what I'm trying to point at is that things have been most severe in the last 3 to 5 years. But I don't see that government has really got a significant... apart from a business as usual approach in terms of what we're doing. I don't think that we were looking at this from a crisis point of view. Sadly, when the impact and when the pandemic hit, we were already in a sort of crisis in terms of the economy and inequality generally. And we hadn't taken it seriously then. It got worsened by COVID. And right now, we are trying to put out fires. So I don't think there's going to be any chance or opportunity for long-term planning. I think government is literally looking to just reach the next hurdle. I think even the approach with the focus on food parcels and food subsidies for households, although is a necessity, I don't think it's sufficient in order to deal with the problem. And I don't think that government necessarily has a plan. And even these meetings with government and policymakers, although they're supposed to bolster the confidence in the economy, it seems as though it's government just reassuring private sector that they will protect private property and stop the destruction of private property, more than it being a collaboration in terms of policy making, in terms of social compacts, in terms of a collaboration with the so-called development partners, which business is a significant part of. I don't see that taking place. I mean, take telecommunications, for example. one of the huge things that have been hamstrung the telecommunications sector has been this issue around regulation of spectrum. We still haven't resolved this thing for close to about a decade now. And we hit COVID-19 pandemic when telecommunication sector was very critical because people needed to work from home and people needed to meet virtually as opposed to physically as we did prior to the pandemic. But we haven't seen any intervention from the telecommunications department to say, okay, now we haven't dealt with the problem for the last 3 to 5 years. Now we're in a crisis. Let's target this at least and enable the sector to grow. And we haven't seen that. And I don't think that now we'll be moving forward and overnight be getting a lot of government implementation of policy or even any fresh new ideas, really. Because there are also all these internal political battles that are taking place internally within government, in the ANC, and it also reflects itself in the policy making and the ways in which a government is coordinating on implementing any kind of development plan. I don't see much taking place in a different view. What are your views on this one?
Basically, what you're saying is that the plan is to say to the private sector, boys, run with it. Do what you can do. We all will do is just put out the fires. Because basically what he's saying is that they won't be able to do anything concerning township economies or rural economies. In fact, let me just say, never mind the rural economies, because our government, since way back in like almost over a decade, they've been talking about rural development. It never has happened. It is not happening. So what ends up happening is that most of that rural folk, especially the young, flood the cities and they go flood the slums. So all the informal settlements were heavily involved in this past unrest, violent unrest, the rioting. So basically, what government is saying is that we. Not. It's not what they are saying. Is their actions? What their actions reveal is that they will not be able to fix what caused the root cause of the violence, because they won't be able to fix. They won't be able to do anything about the township economy.
So here's what I think on 3 issues relating to that. Right. So my first point is. The issue of townships and spatial development is not unique in terms of the slumming, and that not unique to South Africa. That is also a characteristic of modern capitalism, because capitalism generally relies on the reserves of labor which are unemployed. The problem, though, in South Africa is the fact that this coincides with also the historical legacy of why townships were built, precisely to create those labor reserves close to the urban centers across the country. And the problem is not necessarily that those townships or the labor reserves exist. It's the level of poverty is just too low and there's just no dignified life. The quality of life is just, it's rock bottom. And secondly, the fact is that you've got over half of the labor force which are people living in these conditions. And so this is a huge developmental problem that government needs to deal with from a poverty and inequality point of view. The other point I wanted to make was my big worry with the approach you said, like government assuring business to say, boys, we'll take care of the security, run with it, is that private sector and business in South Africa has not necessarily made the right decisions. Firstly, when government intervention came last week in direct response to this, one of the first things they did was to relax the Competition Act to allow for sectors that were affected to share information about stocks, rehabilitation of supply chains, etc. My biggest concern with that is that we are a country that comes from having cartels in almost every sector. We've had a bread cartel, we've had a cement cartel, we've had almost every sector, we've had cartels, and it's the nature of how business operates and behaves in this country. So we can't necessarily pass the baton to business and say, business, please run with the development, because they're not necessarily going to have the consumers in mind when they do operate their businesses. And then the last thing is that I worry that township and rural economies are now going to feel the brunt of an investment strike, or at least benign neglect from business and private sector. We'll just have to watch and observe how the reconstruction takes place. But in a country where government and even some opposition parties have stoked business to implement investment strikes, to implement tax avoidance in response to governance challenges, relying on business is not the best way to ensure that we've got adequate or equitable reconstruction and equitable reinvestment in the economy. I think that, for me, are some of the challenges at a surface level. Obviously, there are deeper issues that have failed rural and township development in South Africa, but I'm just at a surface level, even in the way in which government is interacting with private sector, I don't see it materializing much, precisely because of these reasons I've highlighted.
I agree. There's something peculiar though with South Africa. In South Africa, I'll say in the past 10 or 15 years, there hasn't been any, most able to buy the private sector building all of these big malls, these glamorous, glitzy malls in the townships, meaning there is a consumer base in the townships. That is peculiar because one should understand the character of the township. It's not just only a slum area. There are pockets of what one would call suburbs. There are people with there is enough for the retail sector to go build in the townships. For there are enough consumers.
It is a thriving economy. You're saying that it is an attractive economy for private sector.
For the private sector, yes, but it's a consumption-driven economy. So what they term a township economies, there's no production in the townships.
And I think and I'm sorry to cut in there. I think that's also one of the reasons I don't believe that we can rely solely on government, on business to develop the country, because business will just simply exploit the opportunities that exist. Business is not going to transform society. So business is not going to say, okay, we understand there's no productive capacity in townships, and we do need to provide or relocate our productive spaces into the townships in order for spatial development, in order to transform the spatial legacy of apartheid, etc. Business is simply going to say there's incomes that are there, how do we access them? There's consumption that needs to take place, how do we access it? And for me, that isn't the approach that we need in order to deal with the problems we have, which are we need to restructure and change the direction and flows of money so that there's more money circulating within townships compared to what there is currently. Okay, and that ends our essay update this week. Moving on to the Africa Regional Update for this week. The Africa Regional Update for this week. Our first story for the Africa Regional Update this week is SADC Standby Force Deployment Mission to Mozambique. The Executive Secretary of the Southern African Development Community, SADC, Her Excellency Dr. Stigomena Lawrence Tax, presented instruments of authority for deployment of the SADC Standby Force to the Republic of Mozambique. This marks a major step in the regional effort to combat terrorism and violent extremism in the northern part of Cabo Delgado province in Mozambique. The presentation of instruments of authority follows the approval by the SADC Summit of Heads of State and Government to deploy a SADC standby force to the Republic of Mozambique in support of the Mozambique government to combat terrorism and acts of violent extremism in Cabo Delgado.
Yeah, there's that word. I don't know what that word means, or that phrase. Presentation of instruments of authority. What are instruments of authority?
So, good question. It's almost like a, when, for example, ambassadors are appointed to a specific country. Take, for example, South African ambassador to Zimbabwe. They usually get appointed and they get a letter of credence, which comes from the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, which they then need to present to the president of the country to which they're deployed, mainly because it is almost such a high-level appointment. The ambassadorial appointments are the equivalent of a president. So when they're in the country, they need to present these letters of credence, which then affords them the protocols and all of the benefits which come with the diplomatic mission, such as your diplomatic immunity, etc. And similar with the issue of deployment of foreign military personnel in a different country under a specific authority. So for a military to have authority to act within a specific foreign jurisdiction, they're either there by as part of a war or a declaration of war from another country, or as in the case of the SADC, to operate for a specific mission which is approved by the SADC heads of state and government. And so these instruments of authority are then a similar instrument to the letters of credence that ambassadors would have to present to the president on the other side. So these operatives and the director or head of the SADC mission in Mozambique would then present those instruments of authority, which then gives him and his regiment or platoon or the standby force the authority to operate in Mozambique. So that is the sort of equivalent. I hope that explains it in a comparative sense. Yeah, what exactly is meant by instruments of authority?
All right. Okay. Like in terms of sovereignty, since they are external forces, then now they can act in a similar way, in a similar fashion, as if they are Mozambican forces. Basically, that's what it is.
Exactly. There's similarly the way in which our ambassador would act as though they were our president in a foreign country.
Okay, perfect. All right.
And on that note, we'll move on to our next story on the Africa Update. Sudanese girls living in precarious conditions. According to a recent study, Voices of Sudan 2020, deteriorating economic conditions since 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic have fueled an increase in domestic violence and forced marriage in Sudan. Researchers found that communities perceive domestic and sexual violence as the most common gender-based violence issues. Key concerns include physical violence in the home, committed by husbands against wives and by brothers against sisters, as well as movement restrictions which women and girls have been subjected to. Another concern is sexual violence, especially against women working in informal jobs, but also refugee and displaced women when moving outside camps, and people with disabilities and children in Quranic schools. Forced marriage is also prominent, according to the report. Most of these unions are arranged between members of the same tribe or relatives without the girl's consent or knowledge. To carry out the assessment, some 215 focus group discussions were held with communities and 21 with gender-based violence experts, as well as a review of existing studies and assessments. Research was conducted between August and November 2020, encompassing 60 locations and camps across Sudan.
The Dinka of Sudan, if you want to marry into a Dinka family and you've seen that maiden, you will have to have you have to possess something like 300 cows as dowry, as like bride wealth. So meaning traditionally they value their women in the same way as down here in South Africa, ours won't go that far as to
300 heads.
Exactly 300 heads. That's just way too much. Here it's about what 15, 10, 12 thereabouts. But it shows the value with which the value of a woman. Like there is even a saying that umhlaba mhle ngathi intombi, like after it has rained, we say that the world is as beautiful as a woman or a maiden. So what I'm getting to is that similarly here in South Africa, we're having the same. It's like a repeat of the same. We have the same gender-based violence. Basically, this is caused by socio-economic conditions, because you are talking here about people who have pride in themselves and who have pride in their offspring, their women. We love our women as African people. So these social economic conditions, they are inextricably linked to.
Some people would find it problematic, the mere fact that we're valuing women and equating their value to heads of cattle. So I think that's the starting point, and it's whether or not we find those cultures as palatable. And obviously, one would think that a human being and the life of a human is actually invaluable. And I guess it's also that point that valuing the life or someone with tangible goods in times of economic difficulties is going to lead to those who so-called cannot afford to marry or cannot afford to have a woman being, having to either find illegal means to enhance the violence and the attacks that women are subjected to, or they would have to, steal the money in order to have access to women. And I think it's part of these toxic cultures that are problematic and are making women the target of social developmental challenges as a result of the either men feeling emasculated as a result of economic challenges, which mean in their culture they don't have access to women or cannot get married, and as a result end up forcefully marrying or forcefully forcing themselves against women generally. And I believe that in as much as you may view it in a positive light to say 300 heads of capital is the value or the extent to which that culture values its woman, I think it's in the system of value that values people with tangible goods that makes it problematic, because what happens when you cannot access those goods in order to make a human connection? We take away the human part of it in a way by linking, the value of woman to bride price.
Yeah. Strictly speaking, that there are people who pride themselves also in these traditional cultures, in these traditions. Most people will say this is just symbolic. I mean, the paying of a dowry of a bride wealth is just symbolic. It's what they are trying to do is just to um, merge the two families together. No, sort of like.
But I guess, like passing of money in exchange for goods is also symbolic. It's symbolic of a transaction. And I guess it's precisely these things which are problematic that, you might say it's symbolic and put it in a black box. But actually, what you're saying is, yeah, it's symbolic of a transaction. And that's precisely the problem that we're actually, women are transacted with. Because in exchange for the cattle, the bride price, you get a human being, and I think that's precisely the problem. And feeling as though you own something which you can do what. I mean, if you buy a t-shirt from whatever shop and it's a long sleeve t-shirt and you decide to cut it and make it a short sleeve, nobody's gonna argue with you because it is your object. And I think it's this objectifying of women which makes it problematic and leads them to be victims of gender-based violence.
It would have been nice if we'd had Zama here today in our conversation, because what we would have
Not just problematic as having ourselves as two African men having this conversation about bride price as well.
exactly. Sometimes you get women who also take pride in the practice, who will say, I my bride my dowry was 15 cows, my dowry was 30 cows. They would look down upon others who got married for nothing, who were just given away, basically, type of thing. So I mean, yeah, you say some cow, we need to dig
We really
down
need to
and
center our cultures. Definitely, I agree with you there. But the problem is, just because maybe some women pride themselves in the culture doesn't mean that those women are necessarily free. The same way you get black or non-white apologists for apartheid, or those who claim that things were better during apartheid or under the oppression. For me, it's almost the equivalent. And it's difficult, obviously, to tell people what they need, or to force people to choose their freedom, or to choose their, how can I say, their selves, as opposed to these cultural or social identities. It's difficult to force that upon someone, but definitely people who are sometimes who are oppressed, it will fall into a sort of Stockholm syndrome, or find meaning in their oppression. And that's definitely, I guess, not doesn't make it right either. And I guess these are very, very complex, which reminds me of something I was having a discussion on with someone this week about the care economy. And obviously now with the pandemic, which is affecting elderly people, the care economy has become an important or integral part of COVID-19, but also of our public health system as we deal with the pandemic. And this person was writing about how the care economy needs to be central in the way in which African public health policy is made. And I found that interesting because generally in African culture, the care economy is somehow integrated with the household, right? The fact that elderly people either fall into the household of a relative who then takes care of them. And culturally, we see that as being more palatable or more acceptable than sending people to assisted living facilities or old age homes, so to speak. But at the same time, those elderly people could get better care from professional health professionals. in their in their old age, which a family member would not be able to. And so, for example, someone who could have lived for an additional 20 years purely because they're not getting access to things like physiotherapy or other medical assistance they would get in assisted living facilities, ends up having a shortened life. And she added the point that even more so, the fact that the caring of those elderly people usually falls on the responsibility of women, whether it's the young grandchildren who need to take care of grandma, or adolescent girls who need to take care of their grandparents, as well as younger siblings even. And that definitely keeps young girls out of school. And it's all these cultural norms which, on the one hand, we find so much identity and pride within, that we need to interrogate because precisely of the unequal strain which they place on women, and making it difficult, obviously, to have an equitable society.
Yeah, Joseph, the economist Joseph Stiglitz, was he wrote a big report about for the French government about work that is done in households that were supposed to be paid for. That women need to be remunerated for household chores because they are doing work which was supposed to have been, which you were supposed to hire someone and pay that person for that particular work. I mean, this business of transactions and symbolism and all of that. Yeah, you're right. When you give away your child for a dowry, for some money, that's a transaction. And even and that person goes to that other family, and they get to work there. Sometimes women are treated like slaves, like they are serfs. Transactions and traditions and all of that. Yeah, we need to dig down and come up with solutions. 21st century solutions. Yeah.
Moving on, this takes us to our next story on the Africa Update this week. The next story is rising attacks on slaves in Mali. Attacks against so-called slaves are on the rise in Mali. Although Mali outlawed slavery in 1905, a system of descent-based slavery persists, where some people are considered slaves because of their ancestors who were allegedly enslaved by families of the so-called masters. People born into slavery work without pay and are deprived from basic human rights and dignity. Those who reject the slave designation and try to stand up for their rights, as well as anti-slavery organizations, are regularly violently attacked by traditional or religious leaders and their allies, who sometimes include state authorities in Mali. So far this year, 62 people, 57 men and 5 women, have been injured in violent clashes in the Kayes region in Mali, whilst 80 have fled their homes. Twice as many people, mostly so-called descent-based slaves, have been injured in 2020. The dramatic increase in attacks this year or last year shows that the government's gross failure to protect its people, particularly those who already suffer from most of the discrimination and violence.
Is this slavery? Okay, let me put it this way: is the slavery that is found in the Maghreb or just south of the Sahel, in that vast expanse, that savanna, is it derived from the Islamic religion, or is it part of traditional cultures, or stemming from ancient kingdoms, maybe? What is it? Where does it come from? What is its genesis? I mean, we were talking about dowry just now, and this is a similar thing. Is it a tradition? Is it a religion? What is this one?
Sure. It seems as though to me it's almost a social culture. It's not clear that it might come from religion or the impact of colonialism or general slavery in North America, which is what fueled most of the West African slavery. This one seems to me it's a combination of something similar to the Indian caste culture as well as the traditional sort of so-called slavery that we had in Africa. But obviously, the African tradition of or traditional slavery, so to speak, is very different from the slavery of North America, and the selling of slaves from West Africa into North American slavery. Mainly because traditional African slavery has been one of incorporating people who are either poor or certain designated workers, such as domestic workers, etc., into part of the family, and would not be paid for their services, but would be afforded security and basic human goods, as well as a family or benefits of being part of that family. And so now this seems to me a combination of that and the caste culture in India, whereby certain people and surnames or certain groups of people, by virtue of being born under the system, are then supposedly perpetual slaves. So it is almost a kind of perversion of what I described as a traditional African slavery, or into what this current morphology of descent-based slavery, meaning you might be the child of someone who was taken into a specific family as a slave and was incorporated into that family, but now your children and generations further are still considered to be slaves by the so-called master family that incorporated you. So it seems as though it's one of those.
Like they inherit these slaves, like they
Yes. So
like that particular family will keep on inheriting this slave family.
yeah. So I guess as the children of the former slave grow up, they are brought up by the family's provisions, whether that's food, housing, etc. But when they reach a specific age and can go and find work, or move to urban centers, etc., I guess is that when they become claimed as part of the slavery, and that you might be able to leave your village or go and work in an urban area, and on your return, even in this urban area as an employee, are considered as sort of dissenting slave, and you are perpetually considered a slave, regardless of whether you got a paying job or whether you're still living under the care of the family that you were incorporated under. So it's a bit of a complex one, but they are under attack recently in Mali, and there have been calls for the government to intervene and stop this violence against the so-called descent-based slaves. Very, very problematic place in the Sahel. If you're not being attacked by, violent, religious extremists, you're being attacked by people who are claiming you are a descent slave. It doesn't seem to be. There's just no chill. There's no. There's no way of winning. There's no way of getting away with anything in the Sahel.
Yeah, never rains but pours. Yeah. Yeah.
That brings us to our last story for the Africa Regional Update this week. Our last story is Cameroonians who've been displaced by conflict and climate change in the north of the West African country are turning to aquaculture as an alternative source of income. There are more than 300,000 internally displaced people in the far north region of Cameroon who have been driven by their homes or by both terrorist activity and shrinking of Lake Chad due to climate change. They've been learning how to breed fish in tanks hundreds of miles away from the sea in a region where crops, raising animals, and artisanal fishing on the Lake Chad have been the traditional farming activities for centuries.
And that's a beautiful story for a change. I love just how people take their circumstances and the dice they've been dealt, use their ingenuity to come up with innovations. Like climate change is upon us, and even though Africa is not to blame for the drastic turn of events, we must engage with it, and we must try to win. Is now my question is this initiative sponsored by international donors or aid agencies? I mean, we must not be shy to demand as Africans assistance for setting up programs to deal with climate change. Africa is not responsible for climate change. Maybe this could be another way of attracting development funds. I mean, if we demand our share in like newer, greener or renewable projects, modern energy generation units and those type of technologies. If we demand our that we be part of this, I mean, basically what I'm trying to say is part of the transition. If we are supposed to be part of the transition, then we should be assisted, because we didn't cause this. Anyway, I was just trying to say
It's such a personal thing for you, Sbu. Look, I see your perspective, but as it is, it's sad. Africa definitely hasn't made the worst contribution on climate change, but the issue is, one, the spread of the impact of climate change is indiscriminate. So it's not going to just affect those countries and those peoples who have contributed the most in terms of pollution. Secondly, is the fact that we're on our own. In reality, there's nobody who's going to help us to leapfrog. We can make all the demands we want. That's not going to mean that anybody is going to assist African countries. Yes, this project is funded by donors, and it's the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, which has sponsored this project in Cameroon. But yeah, I can sympathize with you, but the reality is you cannot demand your own development from anybody but yourself. That's the reality.
Yeah.
On that note, that ends our Africa Regional Update this week. And moving on to our last segment, the numbers game. So the number for this week is 4.9%. What's your guess this week, Sbu?
4.9%. I think I talked about this last time. I think so. Isn't that something to do with expected growth, expected GDP growth in South Africa?
Close, but not. I forget the saying, but close, but not a shave. It's actually CPI. So CPI is at 4.9% in June 2021. Consumer Price Index CPI eased to 4.9% year on year in June 2021 after recording a 30-month high in May 2021 at 5.2%. The month-to-month increase in CPI was 0.2% compared to 0.5% last year. And in the month of May, it was 0.1%. The main contributors to the year-on-year increase in CPI were food and non-alcoholic beverages at 6.7%, housing and utilities at 2.1%, transport at 12.3%, and miscellaneous goods and services at 4.1%.
Oh, good. Okay.
I guess we're here feeling, obviously, this is a reflection of a slight easing of those inflationary pressures we spoke about earlier, which were coming off the rising energy prices that we faced in the first quarter of this year. And as we've seen this week, the central bank has decided to keep the repo rate unchanged. And I think it's largely due to the slightly easing inflationary pressures. But I expect that by the time we reach August and September, when the inflation numbers for July and August are released, in September, that the central bank might consider increasing the interest rate at least by 25 or 50 basis points, because one would expect that the disruptions to supply, as well as the interventions, and at least during the rebuilding period, that goods will be more expensive, and so one expects that there would be a much higher level of inflation in July and August as a result of this. But obviously that hasn't passed through and hasn't been recorded as yet.
But I don't get that. I mean, why would you increase your rate of lending when there's not much economic activity? There's not much. There's no growth.
So you're saying, why would you increase your rate of lending?
I mean, your repo rate. Why would you?
But the increase in the repo rate doesn't increase lending. It might increase the appetite for banks to lend, but from a consumer point of view, it actually decreases borrowing because of the higher cost of debt.
Oh, sorry, I made a boops there. I meant repo rate. I meant repo rate.
So why would they increase the repo rate if inflation were to increase? So because we've got an inflation targeting framework, we're aiming for inflation to be between 3 and 6%, right? Yeah, 3 and 6%. And if inflation breaches the upper limit, the central bank would immediately increase interest rates, because the view is that inflation is either spurred on by consumption or creates the expectation that prices will increase in future, and so will lead to higher consumption in the immediate term, thus leading prices to increase further. And to contain that inflation, then the central bank increases the repo rate, which increases the cost of borrowing and is expected to reduce consumption and spur on savings. So, as the repo rate increases, the interest rates on savings also increase. And the idea is that instead of people then wanting to spend more in order to make the most of the value of the money now, they will save and earn more money in future as the interest rate increases. So they will consume less.
But these are imported. These are imported. Like you get your transportation has gone up by 12%. This is imported inflation.
Imported how?
Imported like fuel imports.
Okay, so you're saying there's a pass on because of the higher oil prices, that the fuel cost? Not exactly, because remember, the energy price for fuel was not driven by depreciation of the rand or an increase in oil prices. It was driven mainly by an increase in the the fuel levy in April. And I guess this was then implemented in April, and I guess we're seeing the pass through as people spend more on fuel, as well as transport costs, I guess, in public transport increase as a result of the April 1 increase in the fuel levy. So we haven't seen here the pass-through of the inflationary, which I think came in June and July, because these are the months at which the rand actually depreciated severely, more so in this month as a result of the riots and unrest. I agree with you. In a context of slow growth, we should be more accommodative of higher levels of inflation, mainly in order to drive economic recovery. And But the point is, we've got an inflation targeting approach which keeps us in that 3 to 6 band. Now, it becomes a question of whether that band is sufficient in order to spur on economic activity. For example, other countries on the continent either don't have a target inflation rate, but in Southern Africa, the inflation generally is anywhere between 8 to about 15%. In terms of the high growth economies, if you think of Tanzania, if you think of, to some extent, the DRC, etc. So it becomes a question as to, have we set our band too low such that we cannot actually get the level of consumption needed to spur growth? I'm not sure, because we also have the high inequality problem, right? Given the high unemployment levels and the high levels of poverty. So I'm not so certain that. So I guess I'm saying we should be more accommodative, and that at 3 to 6 we're not necessarily destroying any wealth or undermining macroeconomic stability.
Yeah. Now, if you remember, we ran a story last week, and I said that our currency was at almost like a 2-year high at something like 13 rand 75 to the dollar, and it only shot up to like 14 rand only because of the past week's civil unrest. So basically, what I'm trying to get at is that our currency is not what brought on these increases, like increases in food.
Yeah, so look, what these reflect is largely the energy price increases. Remember, in April we saw that huge increase on electricity and fuel, and these now are passing through onto the food. So remember, for the food to reach your shelves, there's logistic costs, so that's fuel costs. For the food to be produced, that's energy costs. So all those energy and fuel price increases are being passed on to the consumer now, hence the rise in the cost of food and non-alcoholic beverages, hence the rise in the cost of housing and utilities, because now those who are landlords are paying higher price for electricity, and they're passing it on to their tenants, and hence housing and utilities are increasing. So this is largely an impact of the tax increases that we saw in April being passed on to the consumers.
Yes, okay. Anyway.
Yeah. On that note, that brings an end to our episode for this week.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.